with the launch of Total War Warhammer 2 just around the corner, there's a lot of exciting things still to talk about the lore of Total War Warhammer 2, about the lore of some of the respective races that are going to be in it. And in today's little video here, I wanted to talk about the ancient feud between the High Elves and the Dwarfs. This is known by many names. You know, it's got the War of the Beard if you're High Elves, War of the Ancients if you're humans, or War of Vengeance if you're Dwarfs. And this is a pretty integral conflict. It happened 2,000 years way before Sigmar. So it's a very early conflict in the world of Warhammer. And it explains and kind of shows you the results of why the current state of the geopolitical climate, as it is, of the High Elves and Dwarfs, as well as what causes the rise to power of some other factions in the Warhammer world. And this conflict devastated both races pretty significantly, and it hurt the ruling classes of both, and empowered a lot of both the invaders as well as some of the people that lie on the outskirts of not just the people that were the big players in this, the belligerents as they're called, but also the people that could benefit from a weakened High Elf or Dwarf empire. So with this, we'll jump right on into the War of the Beard, starting with the early history of this, the precursor, you know. And what we really have here is the Age of Discovery, and this is when the elves are exploring out from Ulthuan. You know, they're allying with other races, and they're moving out from the demon incursions that have happened in the past couple centuries with Anarian. And dwarfs have established the Karaz Angkor at its height at this point. So all throughout the World's Edge Mountains, with Karak Norn all the way down south in the Southlands. All the mountains going over into Batonia. So the dwarfs have really expanded at this point. And this grand alliance begins. Dwarfs crafting mighty weapons and armor for the elves, and the elves, on the other hand, teaching them them being the dwarfs, how to enchant, as well as literature, art, artistic trade skills, as it is. And this is what really brought a combination of cultures here. You've got the elven silk and steel, the dwarf armor, weapons, and alcohol, really. I mean, to this point, elves do have alcohol, but not the pungent stuff that dwarves do. And you don't get Gromril and Ithalmar from this, but Gromril being the special armor of the dwarfs, and Ithalmar being the special armor, well, aside from dragon armor, of the High Elves. And these are the two of the rarest and strongest armors in the Warhammer world. Now, there's nowhere in the lore that it talks about the armor being influenced by one or the other, but I'm sure that without the methods in this early alliance, one could not exist without the other. So Gromril in and of itself is like basically forged from like meteorites or the such. It's like called star armor or something of that sort. Those of you, the dwarfs experts, can definitely correct me on that. But the ability to enchant it, I'm sure, comes from this knowledge of enchantment through the elves, and the Ithalmar's craftsmanship, I'm sure, come through the dwarf craftsmanship with armor and weapons as well. So I'm sure that these two armors benefit. That's purely conjecture. There's nowhere in the book that it says these two come from this, but these armors, I'm sure, come about from this alliance down the line, at least. There's this big elf town that's established near Marienburg. It's got an exotic name here, Sith Rinosak Namistir. And this is essentially the High Elf Kingdom in the Old World. That's what they're called. They're Sea Elves at this point. And they act as traders, diplomats, and the eyes and ears of the Phoenix King in the Old World. So you have the dwarfs kind of talking through the High Elves at this point near Marienburg. And back then, it was a sizable portion of the former High Elf Empire. During this time, though, Malekith was not a armor-bound bastard, so he actually becomes the ambassador to the dwarfs, spending a lot of time in their holds, learning their culture, kind of becoming what the Lord of the Rings would call a dwarf friend, and getting quite close to them. And this knowledge would actually set the scene for the initial kindling of the War of the Beard soon to come, because after this early history, you've got the Age of Sundering. And this is the Elvish Civil War that we know, that sees the murder of Belshazzar, who is the very first Phoenix King after Anarian. And as you guys know, Malekith was passed up for succession to the Phoenix King, to the Phoenix King. I said Phoenix Kingdom, which I guess would be Ulthuan, by Belshazzar. And this is really the birth of the Dark Elves as a whole, and like I was saying, the kindling for everything. Because from this point, depends on how you want to pronounce this, Druki or Druchi. I like Druchi, but I know it's Druki. Raiding party starts attacking dwarf caravans, and they're all dressed as Asur, which are the High Elves. Just to note that High Elves are called Asur in their language, and Druki are called, or Dark Elves are called Druki in theirs. So these settlements are razed to the ground, and so it's important to note that, you know, High Elf, the relationship between the High Elves and the Dwarfs is so strong at this point that the High Elf, or the Dark Elf masquerading as High Elves, are killing Dwarfs, razing settlements to the ground, and there's still not a war. There's not a conflict right outside of it. Like, they're kind of saying, like, oh, okay, there must be something going on here. So, but it does cause a high amount of tension. It's very, very high. There's a lot of sanctions and grudges being written in the Great Book, a lot of restrictions. Things are coming to a boiling point. But again, it's worth noting that things don't immediately turn into a conflict the second that one thing happens. There's a bit of a back and forth and says, hey, you know, this stuff's going to happen as a result of you being a shithead, more or less. But this is where things really get a bit dicey, since, you know, you do have the perspective of this war from both the High Elves and the Dwarfs. It tends to get a little bit different on what actually happens. What side of the coin are you kind of reading about? So the Elves talk about pleading with the Dwarfs and them being ignorant/stubborn. The Dwarfs talk about trying to avert disaster with the Elves, and the Elves themselves being cold and arrogant to their pleas. Dwarfs in general are at a high tension as well as this, and around that time, Karak Zorn is no longer heard from in the south. So dwarfs, like I was saying, generally they're kind of on edge. Things are going wrong in the Karazhan Corps. This is leading up to a big moment in their history that we'll talk about later. But and they kind of think Karak Zorn, by the way, was suspected to have been overrun by lizardmen. So at this time, you've got the Phoenix King Kalidor II, and you've got High King Gotrek Starbreaker. Those are the two heads of state. So Gotrek appeals directly to Kalidor II, and the Elves, being kind of secretive about the civil war that they just went through, are kind of also at high tension as well. So they're both kind of like at DEFCON 4 without even knowing about it to each other. So the Phoenix King is denying all this is happening, and he asks for a direct claim in person from High King Gotrek. So the dwarfs are rightfully pissed off. So they send Forek Grimbach, who is the ambassador, to appeal directly to the Phoenix King. And the Elves didn't really think this was a real issue. Like I was saying, they kind of thought that this was a hoax or blown out of proportion. But as soon as Grimbach arrives, the High Elves kind of start to come around to, like, okay, maybe this is real. But Kalidor, on the other hand, is not. So Kalidor actually shaves Grimbach's beard after he persists that this is actually happening. Grimbach saying, like, hey, no, this is real, trust me, and kicks him out of the court. This is what really kicks the war into full effect as Grimbach returns to Gotrek beardless, and that is a huge dishonor for dwarfs. And in fact, he actually becomes a slayer as a result of this to kind of, you know, bring his name back to good grace. But even though no one really kind of holds this against him, but that's the kind of the self-riddled honor that dwarfs have. So what this really starts is then the War of Vengeance, and eventually which becomes the time of woes for the dwarfs. That's important to kind of note, because a year later the dwarfs march for war on Tor Alessi, and Tor Alessi is now present-day Lingui. It's really hard for me to pronounce this word because I am not French. L'Anguille. This is the one that's right next to Coron in Bretonnia, but currently at this point is part of the High Elf Empire. So Kalidor gets rightfully quite angry with this, and at this time it's important to remember that the High Elves are still reeling from the Sundering like I was talking about, but they are in no way diminished as far as the race goes. They're still very, very, very strong. What really diminishes them is the 1-2-3 punch of the demon incursions prior to this, the Sundering that just happened, and the War of the Beard that's about to happen. So Kalidor launches a massive fleet from Ulthuan to Tor Alessi to relieve the besieged elves. And in general, it's talked about how the elves are pretty remorseful at this point in the story. Again, this really depends on what book you're reading, but the dwarves talk about elves being blood-crazed and insane, and the elves talk about the dwarves being blood-crazed and insane. So really, it depends on what side you fall on. I being a lore buff and trying to give you an unbiased point, clearly side with the High Elves. The Dwarfs are insane. Who would listen to a bunch of people that smell like cabbage? But moving on from that, you've got Snorri Halfhand, and this is Gotrek's son. And he challenges Kalidor to open combat. And Kalidor, just to kind of backstep here a little bit, has sent a massive fleet out to Torlesi. This is the largest fleet to have ever touched the waters from the High Elves. And there's a lot of that in the Warhammer world. There's a lot of kind of pandering to the point of like, this is the largest fleet. This is the most courageous warrior. He is the best fighter. Like Tyrion's the best fighter. Abhorrish is the best fighter. Wulfric is the best fighter. Everyone's the best fighter of their own faction, basically. But it is talk about this massive naval invasion, naval kind of relief of Torlesi, and Snorri Halfhand challenging Kalidor to open combat. Kalidor then kills him, and the rest of the elves retreat due to just constant losses, and that's going to be a repeating motif here. And this becomes this kind of multi-year retreat throughout modern-day Bretonnia. It's reminiscent of Washington fleeing from the British, but not with the purpose of trying to forego the actual combat that ensues, like Washington did. Smarter general. But the elves trying to stem these massive losses, they eventually get to a point where they do have to have another fight, and the Battle of Orgar begins. And this is really one with another conflict with casualties on both sides being extremely high. It's described in the book as having rivers of blood. Prince Imladric, who is a High Elf prince, fights Morgrim Baugrim in single combat and dies. And dwarves say it's a glorious, honorable duel. Elves say he sacrifices himself to sate the dwarves' bloodlust. Again, it really depends on which book you're reading. Because like in the High Elf book, it talks about how poor Prince Imladric walks out in front of the blood-crazed Morgrim Baugrim and drops to his knees, pleading for him to end the conflict, and Morgrim takes his head off. And in the book, for dwarfs, it talks about how they get into a glorious duel. So it really just depends on what's going on. The High Elves have a tendency to be manipulative and at the same time trying to skew facts. So do the dwarfs don't necessarily try to skew facts, but I would say they're definitely very manipulative and vainglorious. So Morgrim becomes a hero from this. He becomes the Elgidum, or Elgidum, which is elf doom. And the rest of the elves retreat from this conflict. And Morgrim becomes really a new heir to the throne because he's the cousin of Snorri Halfhand. And the elves then, trying to get some sort of victory here, march on Karak Azul, the home of where all the best dwarf smiths are. And the elf offensive really catches them by surprise. And the superior numbers as well allows them to almost overwhelm the inhabitants. But, and this is a really cool guy in the lore, Brock Stonefist rallies the defenders in a grand counterattack through the tunnel systems, routing the High Elf army and earning 2 nicknames. Because he knows these tunnels so well. He knows them like the back of his hands. And the High Elves are not accustomed to fighting through the Karak of a dwarf. It's not part of their previous conflicts. Their conflicts from the past have been with other elves and with demons. So they don't have a lot of knowledge of the depths. So he gets these 2 nicknames. One, Lord of the Tunnels, which is Ungrin and Ancor Rick, and the Nightmare of the Depths, which the High Elves give him. Lord of the Tunnels clearly being from the dwarfs, but the High Elves name him the Nightmare of the Depths, which is Arhain Tosaith. All these really cool kind of elf and dwarf names kind of come out of this, and we see a lot of elf and dwarf names on things as we look on the battle map or the campaign map for Total War Warhammer 1 and 2, but it's really kind of cool to get the almost the Lord of the Rings level treatment of all this stuff. You've got all these great things in Lord of the Rings with like Glamdring and Orcust, who is a guy who watches these videos and will comment on that. Says, hey, thanks for the call out. But there's a lot of stuff in Lord of the Rings that talks about the former days of the High Elves and the former elves, High Elves, Blue Elves, Red Elves, they all exist. And the former days of the dwarfs, and how it's almost this romantic poetry when it comes to talking about it. And it's very much the same with the War of the Beard. But eventually, Brock Stonefist crosses swords with Lord Salindor of Tor Acre, Achare, and thus begins their kind of grand feud that lasts a century of constant battles and clashes. And the Battle of Blind Rivers being one of them. There's not a whole ton of details on that, but this is something to note here, that this is a centuries-long conflict. This is not just a handful of years here. And Morgrim eventually marches on Athel Mariah in what is now modern-day Northwest Bretonnia. Modern-day, like it really exists. But this is the scenic and beautiful elven city that Morgrim just burns and razes to the ground. And the mighty conclusion to Salindor and Stonefist is that as this city is burning down around them, they're last seen fighting to the bitter end in the flames of the town. And they even talk about how if you go to this town now, the ruins of it at least, you can see their ghosts fighting till bitter end, which is just kind of awesome. But this kind of becomes this stalemate. The High Elves can't siege the mountain holds of the Dwarfs, and the Dwarfs can't break the walls of Toralessi. So it's this 450 some odd year conflict that is just costing both factions heavy amounts of casualties. And the majority of Athel-Loren at this time was completely destroyed. So you do have a lot of bystanders being destroyed in this conflict that eventually, it sours things down the road. But you again have this grand moment, though, that does end this stalemate in the Battle of the Three Towers. This is the 14th and final siege of Toralessi. 14 times. Keep that number in mind. So it's 100+ days of constant sieging of the walls. And keep in mind, too, as well, that at this time, the Dwarfs don't have any black powder. So you can imagine how fruitful sappers and engineers, as well as catapults and ballistae, are going to be against elven towers and fortresses and castles. So finally, the Dwarfs got through the wall, which they had essentially obliterated to get through it. But Gotrek, Starbreaker, and Kalidor square off for one final duel. And this lasts, like they say in the books, 3 long days of constant fighting. They don't stop at any one point. They're just constantly exchanging blows. But the story really differs from here. It gets really different from here again. So for the Elves, Kalidor tried to surrender himself to Gotrek to get him to see reason and put an end to the fighting. But again, you'll notice that this sounds familiar, the blood-crazed dwarf slew him and stole away with his phoenix crown. This effectively ended the war and considered the grudge complete. For the dwarves, Kalidor gets tired during their 3-day-long duel, and Gotrek seizes the upper hand, disarming him and breaking his sword with Grimnir, the rune axe, as we all know the name of. Kalidor then begs for his life, and he swears to surrender, and as you would assume, Gotrek kills him after he tries to make peace. Because Gotrek was thinking, I can't trust him. If this is what's making him want to sow for peace, then he's not genuine in his actions, and thus justice demands he dies. So again, he does take the crown because that does sort of say, hey, I'm considering this grudge completed now. So the High Elves try to start a campaign to return the crown, but actually get interrupted by a massive invasion of Ulthuan by Malekith. And this is, again, exactly what he wants. Malekith raises the grand fortress city of Anlek from the ocean and then invades into Ulthuan from there. So how does this result, or what is the result of this conflict? Really what happens is both factions are severely depleted. High Elves declare that all loyal subjects of Ulthuan must return to the homeland to help defend against the Dark Elf incursion. That's because they're so depleted from this conflict that they need every elf on deck pretty much. And a lot of the settlers in the old world get a pretty bad taste in their mouth, so they settle in Athel-Loren. The dwarfs at that time completely destroy the sea elf town I was talking about here. It's kind of got a exotic name, so I'm going to try one more time. Sith Rinosak Namithahir. So they completely destroy that. So a lot of these elves are homeless. So they retreat to Athel-Loren. And this sect grows substantially and eventually becomes the Wood Elves. And the Wood Elves themselves are still connected, in essence, to the High Elves, especially through the world roots and the world tree. But they're very much separate. They don't answer to the Phoenix King. If anything, they answer to the Everqueen, who is directly connected to the spiritual portion of the High Elves, and the Wood Elves on the same level there. And the Dwarfs, despite winning, weaken themselves so much that they can no longer fight off the Skaven and Greenskin incursions that are coming through their tunnels, through their underway, and everything. And this is not an actual one, but there's more and more that come that they just can't defend against. And this is what really, really, really kicks off the Times of Woe with the war being the precursor. Either way, though, both factions killed hundreds of thousands of each other and essentially dethroned each other as their masters of the world. Before this point, you've got the High Elves and the Dwarfs pretty much being in control of everything. There's the Greenskin tribes, there's Skaven here and there, and there's Lizardmen all abound, but Lizardmen have been massively dethroned as well from their former seat of power after the last demon invasion with Anarian and the High Elves. And from there, you pretty much have the next race to rise to power, which is Sigmar and the humans, which comes to fruition now towards the end of this conflict. This conflict takes centuries, as we've found out. So this kind of gives you guys a really good idea to what happens between the beginning of the High Elf timeline, when they are masters of the world, more or less, at post-Lizardmen, and the beginning of the Lizardmen timeline as well, where they're masters of the old world, of the, I almost said the Northlands, but not the Southlands, but they're masters of the entire World's Edge Mountains and the mountains that extend into Britonium. They're the masters of this place. And the War of the Beard is what really sets the table for what becomes the Warhammer world as we know it today. This is a very important conflict, and it is honestly one of my favorite ones in the book, because both sides tell it so differently and so rich and so full of so much color. Again, like I was saying, the Dwarfs talking about so much honor, and the High Elves talking about so much, like, we tried to sacrifice and do all these things. Who's to say which one's right? Probably the High Elves. But thanks for watching here today, guys. We got plenty more videos to come out this week. Hopefully some goodies will be released from Creative Assembly as well, but we'll be doing one on the Elf Pantheon as well to kind of segue into this, or segue from this into that, and some other stuff planned as well. But thanks for watching as always. Have a good one and take care.